If you're watching this on the VLE or you're floating by on YouTube, a very warm welcome. My name is Rory Lees-Oakes, and today we're looking at an introduction to ethical problem solving. This presentation is an overview of ethical problem solving model that counsellors may have to use when faced with ethical dilemmas. It's expected that where practical, recourse to relevant supervision and opinion from a professional body such as the BACP is sought before any action is taken. It's also expected that the client should be part of any decision-making process where possible. I think it's useful to say at this point why the contract is important. I think a lot of ethical dilemmas are usually over confidentiality, and confidentiality should be based on informed consent. Clients should fully understand the limits of confidentiality before entering a therapeutic relationship. Organisations who offer counselling have differing policies on confidentiality. For example, some drug treatment centres ask counsellors to break confidentiality if the client discloses illicit drug use. And the reason for that is that if they're using street drugs and they've got a prescription, then topping up with street drugs puts them in physical risk. They can become very unwell or even die. Always be clear of both the organisation's and the ethical body's code of ethics before offering confidentiality. So as a summary, I'd reflect that you really do need to think about your contract, and you also need to be sure that your client fully understands the limits of confidentiality. And it's good practice to give a client a copy of the confidentiality document or the contract, and also, if possible, to read it to them, because not all clients can read. So it's respectful sometimes just to say, would you like me to read it to you? And just check if they understand the limits to confidentiality. So an overview of this is it's a six-step process. It was visually presented by Tim Bond, who's an eminent figure in the world of psychotherapy and very well noted author. And it's also an ethical problem solving model derived from American sources. It's intended to simulate the consideration of a wide range of possibilities before making a decision concerning an ethical dilemma. And what I'm not going to do today is give an example of an ethical dilemma, and the reason for that is because it could be construed that the way I would solve it is the way you would solve it, and that isn't the way it works. It's important that you make your own decisions. So I'm not going to actually give a problem for you to ethically solve. I'm just going to go through the process of how you would look at problem solving using this model. So first, produce a brief description of the problem or dilemma. Write down what the dilemma is and consider all aspects, such as the impact to the client, impact to the general public, and impact to self. So write down what the dilemma is. Secondly, whose dilemma is it anyway? Your choices will be between the client, the counsellor, or the client and the counsellor. They'll always be there. If it's the client's dilemma, then it's really their stuff to sort out. If it's your dilemma, if it's a case of having to break confidentiality, then that's something you need to deal with. It could be that it's both the client and the counsellor's issue. That the client is asking the counsellor for some help, and the counsellor has to work out the best course of action. 3. Consider all ethical principles and guidelines. So first of all, what codes of standards are available to you? This could possibly be the code of ethics you work to, may even be the guidelines from the agency. What, if anything, does the law dictate? Counsellors aren't above the law, so if you think there is a law being broken and it's serious enough, think about what the law dictates. What actions are prohibited? What can't you do? What are you not allowed to do or you ethically cannot do? What actions are required? What must you think about doing? And what are the people involved entitled by law? So what are the people who this ethical dilemma is? What's their legal rights? Counsellors can't take arbitrary decisions against common law. 4. Identify all courses of action. Consider all forms of action, no matter how ridiculous they may sound. Write them down, and always recommend writing it down. Writing it down gives you a completely different perspective on the difficulty you may be having. Thinking it in your head is one thing. Putting it on a piece of paper and reading it back to yourself will open up a whole range of possibilities. 4. Select the best course of action. Test your selected course of action against universality. Now I'm going to decode that. Would everybody else, reasonably minded people in your situation, do the same thing? That's universality, basically. So would another colleague or a peer do the same thing given the circumstances you were in? Justice. Is it a just outcome? Is what you're doing is it the right thing to do? And when you're thinking about is it the right thing to do, you're thinking about is it the right thing for your client? And finally, publicity. My bottom line with any kind of ethical dilemma is, could I justify it to peers? Could I justify it to my peers, the people who I train with? In some cases, could I justify it to my students, depending on what level they were studying, because no disrespect, they'd have to be at a certain level to understand the technicality of the dilemma. And also publicity. If it ever got into the paper, whoops, how would that feel? And occasionally counsellors do get into the paper. So I always think, if it went to press, how would it look? 6, evaluate the outcome. Was the outcome what you had hoped? So when you started on the process of making a decision, was the outcome that you've looked at and thought about, was it what you hoped would have happened? Had you considered all the relevant factors? So it's about reflective practice. When we have an ethical dilemma, when we get to the end of working it through and coming to a conclusion, we then reflect and evaluate. And sometimes we look back and we might say, if I had thought about this, if I had factored in this, then would it be the right thing to do? Would I do anything different? And would you do the same again? It's okay if you say no, I wouldn't, because that's how we learn. That's how we learn to evaluate and become reflective practitioners. But you need to evaluate your outcomes. And finally, just a thought from Abraham Maslow: if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. The reason I put that in is that if you've only got one course of action and you fall back on that course of action at every opportunity, chances are that you'll use that course of action for every problem you have, and that doesn't give you the wide enough thinking and the wide enough avenues to be able to constructively be creative when you're looking at ethical problem solving. For further information, if you're watching on the VLE, if you click the resource tab above the red arrow, you'll be able to get an ethical problem solving grid from the VLE that you'll be able to take with you. And finally, thank you for watching.